Welcome. Thank you all for joining us, both in person and a few folks online. This is the third talk in this year's kind of public speaker series that we're hosting here through the Department of Educational Foundations. Last month, we heard from Professor Jeff Acido, who spoke about indigenous pedagogy from the context of the Philippines. Check out that talk on our newly created YouTube channel. I'll share that link with everybody before long. Thank you to Frank for your help with setting up that channel. This month, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Reece Jones. So I'm going to introduce him briefly before I turn it over to him. Professor Jones is a Guggenheim Fellow and political geographer who studies the relationship between states, borders, and people on the move. He asks questions such as, why do we have borders? What impact do borders and the state system have on global inequality? What would a world without movement restrictions at borders look like? He's the author of at least 4 books, including Nobody is Protected, How the Border Patrol Became the Most Dangerous Police Force in the United States, White Borders, The History of Race and Immigration in the United States from Chinese Exclusion to the Border Wall, Violent Borders, Refugees and the Right to Move, and Border Walls, Security and the War on Terror in the United States, India, and Israel, in addition to numerous edited volumes. He completed his PhD in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And finally, I was just reading this morning that you have a forthcoming book called Smuggler, which focuses on the true story of Robert Boulay, a US and Canadian bed and breakfast owner who helped asylum seekers cross while secretly working as a government informant. What caught my attention in particular is the fact that this book may be the basis for a TV show with HBO Max, and that you have been working on preparing the script or the screenplay for that. So, congratulations. We hope that that project is successful, and we will be sure to keep an eye out. With that, we look forward to your presentation today, and we are very honored that you took the time to join us. So thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, Brent, for inviting me, and thanks, Yuko, for, I think, suggesting me to join in this speaker series. What I'm going to do is tell you about my book, Nobody is Protected today, which is about the Border Patrol and how they have so much authority to operate so deep inside the United States. And as Brent said, I'm a geographer, and I know this is an educational foundations department, but I give talks about this book to a lot of different audiences. I was at a conference of ethicists last month, talked to law schools. I don't change the talk to fit the audience. I'm just going to present my work, and then you all can think about how it fits into what you all are doing. I'll start out, though, by telling you how I came to be interested in this particular topic. And it was actually, let's see, what am I going to do to press forward? There we go. 15 years ago, I was going to say a decade ago, but time keeps passing. I was working on my first book, Border Walls, and I was down in Texas, south of El Paso, meeting with Bill Addington, who was a rancher whose family had owned land right against the Rio Grande for 100 years, where they were farming cotton with the water of the river. But he was upset with the border wall that the government was building on his land. So he was going to take me down to take a look at it on his property. So we met at a rest stop on the interstate. He jumped in my rental car. We drove the 30 minutes down to the border. Well, not actually to the border, to the wall, which is still a mile or two north of the border. We took a look at it. This is me 15 years ago without a beard. We talked about how it wasn't super effective because it just stops in particular places. And it also really easy to climb over. It's these bollards, and it takes if you're anywhere fit, you can get over that in about 10 seconds. But so that's what we're doing. 30 minutes down there, 30 minutes back in my rental car. It's his dog in the back that rode along with us. But the reason I'm telling you the story is for those 30 minutes each way, an hour total, on public roads in Texas, we were stopped 5 times by the Border Patrol. Lights flashing behind us. One time they sped in front of us and cut us off, wanting to search our vehicle. And I was pretty shocked by that they would stop the same vehicle 5 times in less than an hour on a public road. And most of those times we were 15 to 20 miles north of the border. Bill thought it was kind of normal. He was used to it. He thought it was annoying, but he was used to it happening. But I was shocked. So I was like, can the Border Patrol really do that? Can they stop a vehicle with no evidence whatsoever on an American road, not really very close to the border? And the answer is yes, they can do that. And so that was the impetus for me writing this book was to understand how it came to be that the Border Patrol has this vast authority to operate so far inside the US. So what I'll talk about today, start off with early history of the Border Patrol. And whenever I give talks, I always ask some questions along the way. So it'll be interactive. And the first question I want you to think about is, how long has the United States had a Border Patrol? Is that something that has always existed since the country was founded? And if not, when and why was the Border Patrol created? So that's the first question to have going in your mind. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the 1970s Supreme Court cases, which is the moment that the expansive authority of the Border Patrol comes into question with the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which says that we should have protections from unreasonable searches and seizures within the United States. And so we'll talk about those. And at that point, I'm going to quiz you on the Burger Court, the 1970s Supreme Court. So think in your mind who those people are on the Burger Court, because there are a lot of parallels between the 1970s court and our current Supreme Court. And so we'll kind of talk about that. Then finish up with the current situation. We'll talk about the border zone. So how big is the border zone? Are we in the border zone right now? Think about that a little bit. We'll talk about racial profiling. There was a decision at the Supreme Court, or actually just a concurrence that Justice Kavanaugh wrote about a month ago that got a lot of news about racial profiling. So we'll talk about that and kind of in the context of these earlier cases, talk about the checkpoints, and then kind of finish up with the desire of the Border Patrol to be a national police force. And maybe that's where we can have some of the discussions about what's happening right now. Before we get to the history of the Border Patrol, though, first, I want to make sure we know the different alphabet soup of agencies that are involved in immigration policing in the United States, because it can be a little bit overwhelming. All of them are under the Department of Homeland Security, but there are 5 different groups that have different sorts of authority. So I want to talk about those now. The one that's, I think, familiar to a lot of people is ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Within ICE, there are 2 different units. There's enforcement and removal operations, ERO. When you think of ICE colloquially, that's who you're thinking of. Their job is to round people up who have a removal order and then take them out of the country, right? So they're the ones doing raids on workplaces. They're the ones looking for people with removal orders. The other part of ICE is Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. Until this year, I would usually say that they were the good guys at the border, if there is one. So their job was to focus on drug trafficking. So people think the DEA does that, but they don't do that at the border. It's HSI. But they also focus on child abuse images online, because those things are often hosted on servers in other countries. And so it's really hard to prosecute people who are trafficking in those images. They do prosecute that. They also prosecute spam calls, right? So like if you get a call, you owe the IRS $1,000, you need to go to pull money out of your bank right now and send it to us. Those calls often come from India, but HSI is the one that prosecutes that as well. So that's what they were doing. I say until this year because on Trump's inauguration day, one of his executive orders that day transferred all of the HSI agents over to ERO. So since January 20th, they've also been on the streets rounding people up in terms of those internal immigration operations. So there are 15,000 ICE agents at the start of this year. It was split 7,500 and 7,500, but now all of HSI is doing that. So if you want to do drug trafficking at the border, now's the time, because there's no one patrolling that. And in the big, beautiful bill, though, they're proposing to add 10,000 more ICE agents, right? And I think the idea is they'll fill back in for the HSI agents so they can go back to doing their work on drug trafficking. But that process is just happening right now. I have some contacts with HSI agents, and he tells me he was recently rehired, and he's been watching videos in his office all the time. So they have no job at all. He has no badge, no gun, nothing to do, even though he's been hired in this recent push of rehiring people. So that's ICE. Today, we're not really talking about ICE because ICE doesn't have like patrolling authority historically. Instead, they have very specific arresting people who have a removal order, right? So they're not historically just out on the street looking for people, right? So that's the Border Patrol, who we'll talk about in a second. The other agency is Customs and Border Protection. So within Customs and Border Protection, there are three separate agencies. There is, in the blue uniforms, Office of Field Operations. If you've encountered a border official at an airport, they've checked your passport, looked in your bags, that's Office of Field Operations, right? They only operate at ports of entries, which is airports and border crossings. There are 30,000 of them. There's in the middle air and marine operations. There are about 1,000 of them. They operate boats, airplanes, drones, helicopters, that sort of thing for immigration enforcement. 1,000 of them, and then Border Patrol. So mostly we're focusing on this today because until this year, they were the ones that were doing the actual like policing inside of the United States, and so have the most controversial authority. About 20,000 Border Patrol agents right now, and the Big Beautiful Bill proposes hiring 8,000 more, I believe. Border Patrol wear green uniforms. Their job is to stop immediate entries into the United States. So someone crossing the border, and to prevent that in between crossing points, right? And so as we'll talk about today, originally that was right at the border, but that has changed over time to be deeper and deeper into the United States. So the rest of the story today is Border Patrol, but these Supreme Court cases apply to all of these agencies, right? So they can use these authorities, even though historically they weren't using them for ICE sort of operations. Okay, early history of the Border Patrol. So first question I pose to you, has the United States always had a Border Patrol? So you can probably guess by the framing of the question, the answer is no, but I think most people assume that the US always had. So does anyone know when the Border Patrol was established and why it was established?
1970.
It's older than that. So, I've kind of primed you that it's pretty recent, but it's about 100 years ago, right? So the Border Patrol was established in 1924. So the US didn't have any rules about who could enter the country at the founding. And it wasn't until the 1870s that the first immigration rules at a federal level were put in place. The Page Act, which was meant to ban Chinese entry, and then the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 does ban Chinese entry into the United States. Those are the first immigration laws. So before that, there are no federal laws about who can enter the country. There are laws about who can be a citizen, right? And it's free white person who can be a citizen in the 1791 Naturalization Act. So the Border Patrol isn't established until 1924. So what happens in 1924? There's the passage of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which was in the aftermath of World War I. There were a lot of refugees coming from Europe after World War I, and particularly poor Southern and Eastern European refugees, Jewish people coming to the United States. And the desire was to stop those immigrations, which were perceived as non-white immigrations to the United States, and to shift immigration back to Northern Europe. So it's an absolutely racist bill, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of the people who wrote it. So the headline of the New York Times, the day that that bill passed, says, "America of the melting pot comes to an end." The effects of the new immigration legislation is to preserve racial type as it exists here today, right? And in that same bill, the sponsor of the bill, David Reed, explained what their goal was. It's the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. He said that 75% of our immigration hereafter will come from Northern Europe. The racial composition of America at the present time is thus made permanent, right? It is a very racist bill that was intended to keep America white. So when was the Border Patrol established? 2 days after this went into effect. So the Border Patrol was founded to enforce a racial entry law to the United States. So you can think of the Border Patrol as a racial police force to prevent non-white entries into the country. when you're working on a book, you always look for the character or the story that perfectly represents the point you want to make. And for me, it is in the form of the first Border Patrol agent. So the first Border Patrol agent is this guy, Jeff Milton. So Jeff Milton, before he became a Border Patrol agent, was a sheriff at Tombstone, Arizona. The year after the shootout at the OK Corral, would have been better if he was there that year, but still good. He's frontier law enforcement. He was the police chief of El Paso. He was a Texas Ranger. He also served as a mounted Chinese inspector, which was a position in the customs office after the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then in 1924, he was hired as the first Border Patrol agent. The reason he perfectly symbolizes the racist origins of the Border Patrol is his full name. His full name is Jefferson Davis Milton, and he was named after the president of the Confederacy. He was born during the Civil War, and his dad was the Confederate governor of Florida, and he named his son after his good friend Jefferson Davis. So the first Border Patrol agent was named after the president of the Confederacy. So to me, perfectly symbolizes the racist origins of the agency. Okay, so what are they supposed to do? So David Reed, the author of the bill, was speaking in Congress the next year when they were talking about the authorization for these new agents, and he makes quite clear that they're going to give them warrantless stop authority, right? So they can make stops without having a warrant, but they can only do that right at the borderline, right? So they need to see someone cross the borderline, and then they can stop them without a warrant. They have this lower standard than the rest of the police. Otherwise, they need to have a warrant. So he says during those congressional hearings, they have no right to go into the interior city and pick up aliens in the street and arrest them. It is just at the border where they're patrolling that we want them to have this authority. The illegal entry must be in sight of the officer himself. Otherwise, he has to go get a warrant. We are on alert against granting too much power to these officials to act without a warrant, right? So at the start, they're only supposed to be at the borderline, see someone cross it. Otherwise, they got to go to a judge and get a warrant. It turns out, though, that doesn't work very well for the Border Patrol because at the start, there are only about 300 of them. And they find if they go stand right on the borderline and someone is going to cross, they don't cross right there, right? They go half a mile up the road and they cross in that location, right? So if they stand on the borderline, it's really ineffective for patrolling. So what they start to do is patrol a little deeper inside the United States. So they start to wait at trails leading away from the border, maybe a mile or two inside the US and stop people there, or on roads, maybe 10 miles away from the border and stop people there and ask for their documents. This is really unpopular in border areas. The people who live in these towns hate this, right? Because they are also getting stopped all the time by this new border agency. And so by 1930, there are efforts to reform this, right? And to get the Border Patrol back to the borderline. So the Deputy Treasury Secretary, Ogden Mills, comes to Congress with a plan. Treasury, because at the time Customs was in Treasury. And so he wants to reconsolidate all of the different departments under the Treasury and move the Border Patrol back to the borderline. So he says in his testimony, I do not know about you gentlemen, what you would do, but if I were traveling 20 miles inside the borders of the United States and I had not been out of the country and someone stepped out from the side of the road and told me to stop, I would not stop because I would think I was being held up. If you pass his bill, you will not have a Border Patrol operating 20 miles inside the United States. You will have the Border Patrol where it belongs, and that is at the border. So his bill did not pass, though, because this is 1930, so a year after the stock market crash. The U.S. is entering into the Depression, and this bill would have cost more money to do this reconsolidation, so they decided not to do it. Also, in the Depression, there are fewer jobs in the U.S., fewer people are crossing the border to work. There are not that many apprehensions in the 1930s, and so the issue kind of falls to the sidelines. By the 1940s, the idea that the Border Patrol does need to patrol somewhere inside of the United States starts to be more accepted. And so in 1946, the Border Patrol is able to lobby Congress to change their authorization. So Congress rephrases where the Border Patrol can operate, and they add the words within a reasonable distance of the border. So not just at the borderline, but within a reasonable distance of the border. But Congress does not define what a reasonable distance is, leaves it up to the agency to figure out. And they still have never defined that, Congress, right? So it's not in the congressional legislation where a reasonable distance is. But in 1947, by this time, the Border Patrol is in the Department of Justice. So the Attorney General decides, and they put out in the Federal Register what they've decided reasonable distance means. And they say it means within a reasonable distance from an external boundary of the United States shall mean within a distance not exceeding 100 air miles from any external boundary of the United States. So 100 air miles, right? That's 100 miles from borders. That's also 100 miles from coastlines, right? Because that's also an external boundary of the United States. So just pause to think about that, right? So in 1924, they're supposed to be right at the borderline. In 1930, they were worried that they were 10 miles inside the United States. Now in 1947, they've decided that actually they can go 100 miles inside the United States from borders and coastlines, right? So it's a huge change that's approved in 1947. And that's done without any public debate or consultation. It's just kind of an administrative decision, right? Which I've always mentioned, this is in the hands of the Department of Homeland Security. They could change this, right? This is only just their guidance, right? They could decide their guidance is different, but they haven't so far. Okay, last scene setting before we get to the Supreme Court is the 1965 Immigration Act. So this is part of the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. They get rid of the national origins quotas that were in that racist 1924 bill that we were talking about. And they set up new hemispheric quotas, family reunification visas, different systems for how people can come to the United States. But the one significant thing is that up until 1968 is when it goes into effect. It's past the 1965. There were no limits on Mexican entry into the United States. So Mexicans had to have a work permit to work in the United States, but Mexicans were free to come and go across the border until 1968. After 1968, Mexicans need to have authorization to enter the United States, right? So after this bill passes in the early 1970s, we see a huge increase in the number of apprehensions at the border. I'll show you a chart of that in just a second. But last thing, I want you to look at this picture. Recognize anybody familiar in this picture? Well, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy, but this guy right here, there's a young Dan Inouye there in the background. I think the only non-white person in that photo. So yes, he was, of course, a senator at that point. Okay, so apprehensions, right? So we're focusing on this period, right? So 68. So you see by the early 1970s, the number of apprehensions have gone from like 30,000 to 400,000, right, at the US-Mexico border. So what that means is suddenly there are a lot more cases in the courts, right? A lot more people are being picked up by the Border Patrol. Suddenly there are more lawyers looking at this and saying, can they really do this? So finally, this problem with the Fourth Amendment starts to reach the courts. And so that brings us to the Supreme Court part of the story. Part two. So just to reiterate the problem that we're talking about. So the congressional authorization allowed warrantless stops and searches within a reasonable distance of the border, which was set as 100 miles in 1947. But the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution bans unreasonable searches and seizures everywhere in the United States and requires a warrant in most situations, right? So, and that applies to citizens and immigrants alike, right? There's no distinction in the Fourth Amendment for citizenship, right? So, so these two things are in conflict, right? And so the Supreme Court is going to have to solve this. Okay, so burger court quiz. Did anyone Google the burger court while we were? Okay, so let's see how you can do on naming the burger court. So burger court, this is the burger court in 1973 when the first case gets to the Supreme Court. Burger court is a law and order court, right? So Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968. And he ran on a law and order platform. And one of his key arguments was that the Warren court, the court before in the 60s, was too liberal for defendants in cases, right? There's the Mapp versus Ohio ruling in 1962, which establishes the exclusionary rule, which is any evidence that's collected in violation of the law is inadmissible in court. And then there's also Miranda in 1960, 67, I believe, 66, 67, which you're all familiar with the Miranda warnings, right? So Nixon wins on this law and order platform. He pledges he's going to transform the Supreme Court. And like Trump, he actually gets 4 openings on the court in his first term, right? So he's able to put 4 law and order justices on the court. Okay, so who are these people? So who is this? Anyone know anything about the Supreme Court? So Chief Justice in the middle, and I've been saying which court it is. So that's Warren Burger, right? So nominated by Nixon, very conservative. He's from Minnesota. Harry Blackmun. Harry Blackmun, also a Nixon appointee. Warren Burger and Harry Blackmun were friends since first grade, both from Minnesota. Harry Blackmun, at the time, his nickname was Hip Pocket Harry because he was in the hip pocket of the Chief Justice. So he was a conservative vote at this point. Later in his career, he moves all the way to the left, right? And he's one of the liberal justices in the 1980s. But at this point, he's conservative. Later Chief Justice, very long-serving, William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist is also a Nixon appointee, and he's the most conservative member of this court, goes on to be the Chief Justice, but he changes one of the opinions that we're going to talk about today and creates a lot of the things that are causing the problems for us right now. Last of the conservative justices, there's a block of 4 conservative justices. This is the 4th one. No Supreme Court specialists here. Byron White. Byron White is, he was a football star. He finished 2nd in the Heisman Trophy voting when he was in college at Colorado. Then in World War II, he got to know the Kennedy brothers. So he was nominated to the court by JFK. So although he was nominated by a Democrat, he's conservative and votes with the conservatives on all these cases. So that's the block of 4 conservatives. Then there are 3 liberal justices on the court at this time. Okay, I'll give you an easy one. No? No one? Thurgood Marshall? Thurgood Marshall. He's the lion of the civil rights movement. He wins like 30 cases, civil rights cases in front of the Supreme Court in the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education, for example. And then Lyndon Johnson puts him onto the Supreme Court. So he's definitely on the liberal bloc. The other members of the liberal bloc are William O. Douglas, who is the longest serving Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States. He had joined the court in the 1930s by FDR. And so he's probably the furthest left on this court. He is a very strong proponent. He's like the ACLU, right? So like he's for freedom of speech and rights for both the left and the right, right? So like but he wants the government not involved in our business. And then William Brennan is the other liberal justice on the court at this time. He is a Eisenhower appointee, but he's very liberal, is a key part of the Warren Court in the 1960s. And so he and Thurgood Marshall tend to vote in lockstep during this period of time. So those are the 3 liberals. So 4 conservatives, 3 liberals, 2 swing votes. The 2 swing votes are conservative, right? It's like our current court, right? You have to convince some of the conservatives to swing, but they're kind of the middle conservatives. They're not the radical conservatives. And so that's our 2 over here. Potter Stewart. So Potter Stewart was also put on the court by Eisenhower. The thing Potter Stewart is best known for is his concurrence in Jacob Ellis, which is the case about obscenity in the 1960s. This is where in his concurrence, he says that pornography is hard to define, but he knows it when he sees it, which of course is quite a cell phone for a Supreme Court justice in the 1960s. So that's Potter Stewart. And then Lewis Powell is above him. Lewis Powell is the 4th of the Nixon appointees. He is a corporate lawyer, right? So he was a lawyer for Philip Morris, the cigarette company. He was also a lawyer for chemical companies, right? So he knows corporate law really well, but he doesn't really know constitutional law. So he tends to rely heavily on his clerks. He's also a reasonable guy, right? So he's going to be kind of in the middle on these these things. The two of them over there are going to be your middle justices. Okay. First case. So 1973, Alameda Sanchez versus United States. The question in this case is, can the Border Patrol search any vehicle in that 100-mile zone with no evidence whatsoever? Just they decide to search it, they search it. So this stop happened on California Route 78. It's an east-west road. It does not connect to the border, and it never gets closer than 20 miles to the border, right? So we're talking well north of the border, going east to west. So Conrado Alameda Sanchez was driving at night. He was pulled over by the Border Patrol. They checked his documents. He was in the United States legally. He had a valid work permit. He's a Mexican citizen, but valid work permit to be in the United States. But they decided to search his car anyway. They search his car and find marijuana, and they charge him for trafficking marijuana. So luckily for him, he gets a very good lawyer. So this guy, John Cleary, had founded the Federal Public Defender's Office in San Diego in 1969. And so all of these cases with the Border Patrol land on his plate in the early 1970s. So he's the lawyer in all of the Supreme Court cases that are about the Border Patrol. But before that, he was in the special forces in the military. He wears combat boots when he goes into court. But he feels for sure this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment, right? He is absolutely certain that they could not search this vehicle, right? And so takes it to the federal district court and loses. Appeals it to the Ninth Circuit, which then, as now, was more liberal than the Supreme Court, and he loses unanimously at the Ninth Circuit. So for some reason, decides to appeal it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides to take it up. And so he heads to Washington, D.C. to make his case to the Supreme Court. Okay, so in the oral arguments of this case, Thurgood Marshall is talking, the Border Patrol's lawyer is explaining their authority, and he says, yeah, we have the authority to search every vehicle in the 100-mile border zone. That's what it says. And so Thurgood Marshall's like, okay, every vehicle? He's like, yes. He's like, okay, could you search Chief Justice Berger's vehicle if he's driving in the border zone? And the lawyer's like, yeah, it says every vehicle, right? So with no evidence, Okay, so Thurgood Marshall's like, all right, what about the President of the United States? If Richard Nixon is driving in the border zone, can you search his vehicle? And the lawyer's like, but then eventually he says, yeah, it says we can search every vehicle in this border zone. And so Thurgood Marshall says nobody is protected, which is the title of the book. Okay, so after the Supreme Court hears a case on Fridays, they meet for a conference at 10 a.m. in a conference room, just the justices. They talk about the cases, and then they take a straw vote of where they're going to vote in the case. So in this case, the straw vote is 5-4 in favor of the government, saying that they can do this search. And so it's the 4 conservative justices and Powell. Justice Powell is for the government, and then the 3 liberal justices and Potter Stewart are for Alameda Sanchez. So they give the case to Byron Wright, and he starts working on his opinion. Potter Stewart, though, is outraged by this, right? He thinks it is a clear violation of the Constitution. And so he writes his dissent. These documents now are in the public record, so you can go read them. His early drafts of the dissent are like 3 exclamation points, right? Like he's fired up, right? He thinks this is the most ridiculous thing he's ever heard. And he's trying to convince his other moderate justice, Lewis Powell, that he should not support this. Lewis Powell, however, has kind of a different view. He tends to think that law enforcement are mostly good people and that they're going to do the right thing when they stop someone. And then moreover, he says, you know, if they searched my car, they wouldn't find anything. So it doesn't matter. I'd be on my way, right? But if they search your car and they do find something, then you're breaking the law, right? So to him, he doesn't see the big deal of it, right? But he has a clerk in his chambers who does think this is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so the clerk says, he tries to convince Lewis Powell. Powell's like, okay, before I sign on to the final draft in June, you can come back to me, we'll talk about it, and I'll make my final decision then, right? But then June rolls around, the Supreme Court is really busy at that time of year, and Powell forgets about this conversation with the clerk, so he just signs on to the opinion that says the Border Patrol can do this search. The clerk hears about it and storms into his office and says, "You promised me that you were going to listen to me before you signed on to that opinion." And Powell's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot." He's like, "Okay, how about this? You write me a memo tonight. I'll read it tomorrow, and then I'll think about it." Right? So the clerk goes off, writes the memo, gives it to Powell. Powell thinks about it. He reads the pro Border Patrol ruling. He reads Potter Stewart's dissent, and he changes his mind. So 7 days before this was going to go into law, he changed his vote. And so he switches from the Border Patrol to the Alameda Sanchez side of it, right? So the decision comes out, 5-4, no, the Border Patrol cannot search any vehicle in the border zone. Instead, they have the exact same rules as the rest of the police, which is they either need consent, they need a warrant, or they need probable cause, right? So searches are off the table for the Border Patrol. The reality is most people just consent, right? If they come up and say, can I look in your trunk? You say yes, you've given them permission to, right? You could say no. But they have the same rules as the police. So this is a really surprising decision, right? Because think about this. This is a case that was unanimously for the Border Patrol at the Ninth Circuit, which was more liberal than the Supreme Court. And this Supreme Court was a law and order Nixon Supreme Court, right? With 6 conservative justices, but somehow we're 5-4 in favor of the immigrant in this case, the man. So the lawyers from San Diego leave this ebullient, right? They are just thrilled, right? Because they've won this case against all odds. And so then they go back to their practice and they contest every single stop by the Border Patrol, right? So if they can't do searches, can they even stop people in this 100-mile zone? It's not clear, right? So, and then that's going to be the issue in the next case. So the next case is the most important case, is 1975 Brignone Ponce, United States versus Brignone Ponce. Can the Border Patrol stop a vehicle based only on the race of the driver? So this was a case where the Border Patrol was 65 miles north of the border. So we were at San Clemente, California, kind of on the outskirts of Los Angeles, on I-5 on the interstate highway. This was at night. It was raining. They turned their car sideways at the side of the interstate, watched cars driving by in the headlights. And when they saw someone that they thought looked Mexican, they pulled him over. So the driver was Felix Brignone Ponce. Turns out he was from Puerto Rico. So American citizen by birth, legally in the United States, of course. But his 2 passengers were not. He had someone from Guatemala and Mexico in his car, and so they charged him with transporting illegal aliens, right? Which is the terms in the law. And so that's the case that goes to the court. So same 9 justices, same lawyer from San Diego again. One thing that did happen, though, is in between those 2 cases, William O. Douglas had a stroke, right? He was the oldest justice. He had a stroke on New Year's Eve in Bahamas in 1974, but he decided to stay on the court in 1975, even though he was not present. He didn't give up his seat, right? And there's nothing you can do, right, for Supreme Court justices. So the rest of the justices had a meeting, the other 8 of them, and they agreed that they were not going to decide any cases 5-4 where Douglas was the deciding vote, right? So if a case was 5-4 with Douglas as the deciding vote, they would roll that case over till the next term, and they were sure he would have to have retired by then, and they would hear it later. Right. So this case, Brignone Ponce goes to the oral arguments. They have their conference, and it's 5-4 in the same configuration as last time, right? With the 3 liberals, Powell and Potter Stewart. And so since that means that Douglas's is the deciding vote, they assign the case to Lewis Powell, and he has to figure out what to do, right? So he tries for a little while to convince the conservatives to join him in this case, but he's not able to do it. So by April, he's decided we can't do this one. We've got to roll this case over till the next term, right? And so that's the decision they've made. But that afternoon, after he sends that memo to the rest of the justices, he gets a call from his friend who is on one of the circuit courts where they have, and his friend says, we have like a dozen cases that are about this issue. Like, you have to make a decision on this, right? And not only that, you need to make a decision that also gives the Border Patrol some guidelines, right? So, like, if they can't make this stop, when can they make a stop, right? So Powell's like, okay. He goes back to work and tries to find a way to get some sort of consensus on this case. So it's at that moment that William Rehnquist seizes opportunity. So Rehnquist sends a memo to the other conservatives. The title of the memo is Dear Losers, because they had lost the argument in this case. But he says, look, we've got an opportunity here, right? Powell, he's conservative like us. He wants us to sign on to this case. Why don't we agree to let this guy go? But in exchange for that, let's put in much more stringent rules for the Border Patrol, right? So that the Border Patrol has really clear when they can stop people, and that those, I said stringent, I mean broad, right? That they can stop as many people as they want, essentially, right? And that's what ends up happening, right? So Powell agrees to this, changes his ruling to put in place these suggestions by Rehnquist, and so the decision ends up being 9-0, that no, the Border Patrol cannot stop someone based only on race, right? So it's another win for the federal defenders from San Diego. And in this case, shockingly, the entire conservative law and order Supreme Court of Nixon says that no, they can't do this stop, right? So on its surface, it seems like a huge win, right? But it's not, because of those additional guidelines that get added into it, right? So you'll still see today, people will mention this case and say it says that they can't stop based on race. But actually, it says they can stop based on race as long as they have one more factor, right? And I'll explain that to you in a second. So, so the key to this case are is the standard of articulable facts of reasonable suspicion that they add in to give that Border Patrol the guidelines for when they can stop someone, right? So these are the word for word from the ruling. So the first set of characteristics, these ones are important because they're generalized to an area. They're not particular about the vehicle that they're stopping, right? So it's things like proximity to the border, usual patterns of traffic on a road, information about illegal border crossings there, alien traffic in this area, right? So if you think back to the stop that happened to me, the 5 times I was stopped in an hour, right? I was an unusual car on this road. And maybe the week before they stopped someone who was sneaking across the border at that point. That's enough, right? That fulfills these characteristics. That gives them the reasonable suspicion to make the stop, right? So this part alone is so generalized, right, that they can use that to justify more or less anyone, right? But they're going to be more. The second set of ones are about the specific cars, right? So things that the specific people did. So station wagons. So don't drive a station wagon near the border. People trying to hide, a lot of people in the car, the driver's behavior, right? And notice it's not specific about the driver's behavior. So people who've done studies about this afterwards have found there'll be one case where the Border Patrol will say, the driver kept staring at me, and that was really suspicious, so I pulled him over, right? But then the next case will say, the driver refused to look at me, and that was suspicious, and so I pulled him over, right? So you can use this to do anything, right? So that's the next set of characteristics. But the last two are the worst ones, which are the ones about race. So I'll read these directly. So the characteristic appearance of persons who live in Mexico, relying on such factors as the mode of dress and haircut, and then previous experience with aliens. So just like you shouldn't drive a station wagon near the border, you should not have a Mexican haircut near the border. They'll look for that. But the last thing here is the most important part, right? So previous experience with aliens. This is what they use to say that they can use race in their decisions, right? So they can say, last week I stopped someone who was Middle Eastern and they didn't have their documents. So this week, this person driving right here looks Middle Eastern, so I can stop him, right? They look Middle Eastern and they're near the border, right? They look Asian and other people have crossed in that same area, right? They just need two of these. Two of this whole list is enough, right? So that's the ruling. Um, okay, so at the time, though, they didn't quite get what had happened here, right? So the federal defenders of San Diego, I've interviewed these guys for the book, and they thought they'd won that case, right? So they didn't really understand the implications of the rest of that case. But the last case, and I'll do this one real quickly before we get to the current implications, is Martinez Fuerte, 1976. Can the Border Patrol use permanent checkpoints in the interior of the United States? So this is the same location at San Clemente, 65 miles north of the border. The Border Patrol had set up permanent checkpoints, right? Like signs, stop here, federal agents. And then they were sending people to secondary inspection, and they were asking everyone about their immigration status, right? So the federal defenders thought they were going to win this case, right? Because they thought that the Border Patrol had, if they have to have at least two facts to stop a vehicle, just one vehicle, there's no way they'll let them stop every single vehicle on the way through the border. But it turned out they were wrong, and the Supreme Court did allow them to do that. So 1976, can they set up these interior checkpoints? The answer is yes, 7-2. So William O. Douglas had left the court by the time this was decided, and he was replaced by John Paul Stevens. So like Harry Blackmun, John Paul Stevens joined conservative, eventually becomes the most liberal justice when he retires about 10 years ago. But he's voting with the conservatives here, so it's 7-2. So can they set up the checkpoints? Yes. And so this gets back to Powell's idea that federal agents are mostly doing the right thing and that this is not a big imposition on people, right? So in his view, it takes a couple seconds to stop, right? It's like a toll booth to him. And so it's not that big of a deal, right? Is the decision. And so that's why they decided to go along with it from their discussions behind the scenes. So this stop also this ruling in 1976 also explicitly says that they can use race. So thus, even if it is assumed that such referrals to secondary inspection are made largely based on apparent Mexican ancestry, we perceive no constitutional violation, right? So both 75 and 76, they can do racial profiling. In this case, William Brennan realizes his error, right? So I talked to one of his clerks about this case and the previous one, and the clerk says he doesn't think that Brennan actually read the previous decision after the changes to it, right? If you recall, it was already 5-4 in his favor. He was one of the five. And so when it eventually went 9-0 in his favor, he's like, oh, great, we won, right? He may not have really read what happened in those changes between the kind of initial draft and the very final draft. But he did read this one and didn't like it. So Brennan has a fiery dissent in this case. He says, the result is the Border Patrol is free to stop any and all motorists without explanation or excuse, wholly on whim. And this process will inescapably discriminate against citizens of Mexican ancestry, right? It goes on and on like that in the ruling. And he turns out to be correct. That's absolutely what's happened. Okay, so as way of conclusion, to kind of go through the current situation, the first thing that I want you to remember is the Border Patrol was founded as a racial police force, right? It's founded to enforce a racial law. It has done racial policing through its entire time. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court considered this and said, yes, they can do racial profiling. And as I'll show you in a minute, they've considered that again a couple times, and they continue to say, yes, they can do that. And their results are also racially discriminatory. I'll show you some of that data in a second. Second thing is the 1970 Supreme Court cases gave exceptions to the Fourth Amendment and allowed racial profiling and did not dispute that 100-mile zone. By the way, in these cases, I didn't talk about it today, but in the book I do, in the cases, it's clear that the justices think they're only talking about the Mexican border, right? When they're making the decisions, they don't think they're talking about coastlines or the Canadian border, but they were. So it definitely applies in those places. So are we in the border zone right now? Yes, there's nowhere in Hawaii that's 100 miles from a coastline, right? So the entire state is the border zone. So we're there, right? All red. There are many states that the entire state is in the border zone. So like Michigan, most of the Northeast is completely in the border zone. Florida is completely in the border zone. 2 out of 3 Americans live in that border zone, right? So where the Border Patrol can make stops based on this lower standard, they can use racial profiling, and they can set up those checkpoints on roads in that entire area. Okay, so the other thing that is the conclusion from my book is that when these decisions were made, there were only about 1,500 Border Patrol agents, right? And they thought they were only talking about the US-Mexico border. Today, there are 20,000 Border Patrol agents, right? And there are also 15,000 more ICE agents, right, that can also use this authority that just didn't exist in the time that they were making the decisions. So the result of that is these things are happening in a lot more places than they were before. So in terms of the number of Border Patrol agents, this is the chart of how many Border Patrol agents. Really, it's the Clinton period where we see the first doubling, and then after September 11th, we double again in the number of Border Patrol agents. So one way that that has impacted American citizens is through checkpoints inside the United States. So this is that third ruling that I kind of rushed through, but let's spend a moment kind of thinking in more detail about that. So this is a chart from the Border Patrol, from an Inspector General report about the interior checkpoints. So between 2016 and 2020, the Border Patrol operated 113 interior checkpoints inside the United States. So remember, we're not talking about port of entries. We're not talking about going into Canada, right? We're talking about between one American town and another American town, a Border Patrol checkpoint set up on those roads. They have two different types. They have permanent ones that essentially look like toll booths, right? They're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For those are the circles on this map. And then they have also temporary ones. These ones I think are more insidious because they just pop up and they might be there for 24 hours on a highway. This one is in Vermont, for example, and then they're gone, right? And they just can check every single vehicle that's passing through these checkpoints. So what are they doing at these checkpoints? So in the original ruling, in the 1970s, the Border Patrol was really only doing immigration enforcement, right? And so the ruling is very specific that they should only be doing immigration checks at these checkpoints. But today they're doing much more than that, right? So they are walking dogs around each of the vehicles, right, to smell for drugs. They have license plate readers and they store the license plates of every vehicle that passes through an interior checkpoint for 20 years in a database. 50 million American vehicles pass through a checkpoint every year inside the United States. So many of those are multiple times, right? People going back and forth to work go through it every single day, right? So that sort of thing. And they also have radiation sensors at these that are supposedly looking for dirty bombs. But what they often find are people who have had chemotherapy, right, or radiation therapy for cancer. The 91-year-old governor, former governor of Arizona, Raul Castro, was stopped and held for 30 minutes at a checkpoint between Nogales and Tucson because he had recently had cancer therapy and then set off a radiation sensor at an interior border checkpoint. So the result of this interior policing is this almost exclusively targets Americans, right? People who are inside the country, right? So even though it's supposedly for immigration enforcement. 91% of the drug arrests at internal Border Patrol checkpoints are American citizens. All of these famous people have been cited by the Border Patrol for drug violations inside the United States. Almost all of these are at Sierra Blanca checkpoint because the interstate that goes from Los Angeles to like San Antonio and Houston passes very close to the border. And so a tour bus driving from LA to Texas actually would go through that. So you can actually find maps online for tour buses to go around these checkpoints, right? It involves driving up to like Colorado to go around the checkpoint. But yeah. Racial profiling, some groups in Arizona, No More Deaths, have done work on and patrolling these checkpoints and monitoring. They found that people of color are 26 times as likely to be asked for an ID at an internal checkpoint and 20 times as likely to be sent to secondary inspection, right? So they're allowed to do racial profiling and they do racial profiling. Obama administration took a look at this. So in 2014, Eric Holder Attorney General and Obama considered racial profiling for federal police, and they banned it for most federal police, banned, except this guidance does not apply to interdiction activities in the vicinity of the border or to protective inspection or screening activities, right? So Supreme Court in 1975, Supreme Court again in 1976, Obama administration in 2014, they can use racial profiling. And then, of course, in the news recently was Kavanaugh's concurrence in Noam Vasquez Perdomo. If you read that case, the very first citation is Brignone Ponce, right? So essentially, all Kavanaugh was doing is saying, we already decided this in 1975 and like restating what they had already decided. So people treated it as if it was a new ruling, but it wasn't. It was just restating what had already happened. So last thing I talk about in the book, don't have a ton of time to talk about now because I think I'm more or less done. But the Border Patrol definitely envisions itself as a national police force. As they have grown, it turns out they actually don't have that much to do at the border. So in the book, I put together the data of apprehensions and agents from 2010 to 2020, right? Because the book came out in 2022, and looked at how many apprehensions they had per agent. And it worked out to, I believe, 22 apprehensions per year per agent, right? So that's like less than 2 apprehensions per month per agent for that entire period of time, right? So, that would mean, you know, shift after shift after shift of sitting in your car, bored, looking at the border wall, right? That's what Border Patrol agents were doing in the 2010s, because there were way more of them than necessary. And so the result of that is they've been trying to find these other things to do, right? And so that's why they're doing all of this interior policing. That's also why they are always available, because they've got way too many agents, to be signed up for these other policing practices in the interior of the United States, right? So like the 2020 social justice protests, it's the Border Patrol agents who are the ones that are beating people up in Portland, right? Because they're protecting federal buildings, right? And so it's the same thing happening right now. Okay, that is what I had for you today. Thanks for coming and listening to me, and now I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much. We have a bit of time, so I'd like to open it up for questions. Please take the microphone.
I'm wondering if you have any data about how this is working in terms of U.S. territories like Samoa or American Samoa, Puerto Rico, etc.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. There is a Border Patrol station in Puerto Rico, but there is not in any of those other locations. So it's a question that people ask me, and I should know more about it, but I don't. So I'm not sure that I can speak to it.
I think maybe there's just something I'm missing about like how it went from that buffer zone of the border to Chicago.
Chicago is in the border zone.
Is it?
Sorry, going the wrong way. Oh, jeez, that didn't go well.
It's because you're in the border zone.
Did I pick the right one? Yeah, so they count, this is something that's controversial, but they count Lake Michigan as an international waterway, right? So in their map, they draw it around like that, right? So things like Milwaukee, a lot of Michigan, this part like Indiana, Chicago, is in the border zone by their definition.
Right, because none of the other maps look like that. Like the line goes across the top.
Yeah. International waterway,
Um,
the justification. Yeah.
Could you comment? So I read the news but I think you might have more clarity when it comes to the differences between these different police forces. And so how does the different police forces that you mentioned today relate to what we're hearing about more recently, with Trump's desire to have his kind of personal, um, you know, personal police force that he can use, and that people are worried that he would try to use perhaps later to prevent the democratic transition of power, right? So like I hear about that in relation to is it the National Guard, maybe? I mean, uh, are you kind of up to date on these things? How does that connect with this?
Yeah, not on the National Guard, but I think definitely the Border Patrol is ripe for doing this, right? I mean, National Border Patrol Union's first presidential endorsement ever was in 2016 for Trump, right? And they endorsed him before he was clearly the candidate even, right? So like if you remember kind of earlier in the process, it wasn't that clear that he was going to win that nomination. They endorsed him early on, right? So they've been on board with him for a long time. And so they're kind of uh, open to his sort of things. And they've wanted to do this more internal policing, right? There are a lot of things that at these internal checkpoints, right, is one example of that, where they are doing this policing for a lot of different things that are not really part of their mandate. And one way that they get around that is by having other police there with them. Like there's a thing called Operation Stone Garden, which if I'm gonna try to go forward now and let's see if can do it safely. In the big beautiful bill, so Operation Stone Garden, sorry, it's not the best thing here, $450 million for Operation Stone Garden. So that is a thing where they pay local police overtime to go on patrols with the Border Patrol. And then by having the local police there, then they can charge people for crimes that are under the remit of the local police, right? So like if they find someone drunk driving at an internal checkpoint, for example, normally that's not something that the Border Patrol does, right? But if they've got the local police officer there, they can then hand that over to them, right? And it allows them to do that internal policing. I think we're seeing a similar thing. A question I often get, so I'll pose a question to myself, is do these decisions at the Supreme Court only apply to the Border Patrol, or does this also apply to ICE, right? That they can use this racial profiling and this internal policing authority. And I think it's not 100% clear, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think what you often see is that they have Border Patrol agents on these outings with the ICE agents, right? They're often these multi-unit task force roaming around doing things, because the Border Patrol clearly does have this authority, right, to police inside the United States, right? Whereas ICE traditionally didn't just roam about, right? They went directly to do something, right? Like they had a removal order for this person, they go find that person, right? Or they have a warrant to search a workplace, they go search that workplace, right? But the Border Patrol has the authority just to kind of roam around, right? And then see stuff and stop people, right? And so I think that's why you're seeing these like joint task force. But I think also probably the Trump administration would argue that these rulings are for all immigration authorities and so that they apply for ICE as well. But I'm not sure that that's completely clear.
Reece, you said that, is this working? Is this just for that? Okay. You had mentioned that previous rulings had specified that Border Patrol should only be engaged in immigration checks, but they've expanded what they look for. Is there any statutory basis for that? And if not, are they being challenged? Like how is this possible?
Yeah, so they have expanded the definition. So the wording is like, patrolling the border for entries, right? And so they've expanded their understanding of what that means, right? And so by the 1980s, they were focusing more and more on drugs, right? And looking for the entry of drugs into the United States. But it's particularly after September 11th that they really transform what they're doing. Like in this book, actually, I talk about if you go to the Border Patrol's website and you look at like their ethos and like their mission and things like that. Like it actually doesn't even mention immigration in there anymore, right? It's like protecting the homeland from terrorist infiltrations, right? Is like the what they see themselves as doing, right? Is like the primary thing. And so it's that preventing entries is the mission.
And that's an internal guideline rather than a statutory basis for that?
Yeah.
So why isn't it being challenged?
Well, I mean, agencies have the ability to
Right,
interpret their
to guideline.
guidelines, right? Like,
So I guess you'd have to challenge it on some constitutional basis.
yeah.
It's okay. So, we keep, hearing reasonable and unreasonable, suspicious and reasonable, searches and distance and like that. So who gets to decide what is reasonable and unreasonable? Is it also going back to Enlightenment way of kind of talking about this world? So then is it arbitrary, what is reasonable and unreasonable? So
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I'm not sure that I can answer that one. But I mean, in terms of the articulable facts of reasonable suspicion, right? The Supreme Court laid those out, right? It's those 14 items that were in that ruling, right? Or the things that they can use for reasonable suspicion. But as we saw, they're so broad, right? That they can be used in a lot of different ways to justify more or less any stop by the Border Patrol. And then the reasonable distance, right, of the border, that's also it's up to at the time, the Attorney General. Now it's in the Department of Homeland Security, so they could change their mind on that, right? So when I would give this talk before the Trump administration, I would say that's the thing maybe we should focus on the most, right? Like if they could just change that to like 1 mile of the border, right? That would completely transform the experience of this Border Patrol, right? And particularly like on issues of migrant deaths, for example, like why are people dying in the borderlands? It's actually not to cross the border itself. It's fairly easy to get across the border itself. And like you can see that in the rate that smugglers charge, right? It's been a little while since I've had the latest rates, but at one point it was like $1,500 to be smuggled across the border, and then it was like $6,000 to be gotten past the checkpoint, right? So the checkpoint was really the barrier to the interior of the United States. And you hear about people in Arizona walking like 60 to 80 miles through the desert, right? Why are they walking so far? They're not walking that far to get across the border. They're walking that far to get around the checkpoint, right? That's the 60 to 80 miles in the desert, is inside the United States to get around the checkpoint, right? Why are people in the backs of tractor trailers near San Antonio, right? It's to get past the checkpoints, right? So that's the thing that I think results in a lot of the migrant deaths. It's also the thing that allows them to do a lot of this internal policing. So shrink that border zone, it would make a big difference. I can take it. Maybe I'm the closest.
How do you envision the future, the next 3 years I mean, what is our task, right? And how do you see this as accelerating and I mean, it's, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. I mean, that's so this book came out during the Biden administration, right? It came out in 2022, but it was already clear at that point that this had expanded dramatically, right? If you look at it was about 50 years since those Supreme Court decisions, right? So it'll be like 50 years this year, right? Since Brignone Ponce. And so over that 50 years, it had gone from 1,500 Border Patrol agents to 20,000 of them, right? That is a huge increase. And they're doing these things in places that they were never doing them before, right? If you looked at that map of where they were doing those internal checkpoints, like a third of them are up at the northern border, right? Which I don't think was in a lot of people's minds for where they're doing internal checkpoints, right? And the point I make is they can do that anywhere in that border zone, right? They have not yet set up a checkpoint on H1 and stopped every single vehicle and asked for people's identification. But they can. They could do that today, right? And it's completely legal, right? And if we see how much it's expanded in the last 50 years, what is that going to look like 50 years from now? It's going to look really bad, right? So I think there's that longer term look at it. That's certainly what I talk about in the book. But in terms of, the present moment, right? I think you already see the Trump administration repurposing these Border Patrol agents to use this patrolling authority in the streets in the United States, right? They're doing it in that 100-mile zone, though, right? It's in Los Angeles, it's in Chicago. All of the cities where they've deployed the Border Patrol have been in that 100-mile zone.
I had another question which was going to go in that direction. I think you mentioned that it's Border Patrol has been present in Portland, right? Because of the protection of the federal buildings. But that also seems like unrelated to what I would think of as Border Patrol, right? And so, it's not hard for me to imagine a future where there could be increasing civil unrest, particularly in relation to the next election. And I'm wondering, how might, Border Patrol come into play then, since, as you said, 2/3 of Americans live within 100 miles of the border.
Yeah.
So it's like I could imagine this force being used in ways that it hasn't been used traditionally.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, let's assume that there is civil unrest related to the next election. Should we expect to see more of what we've seen in Portland? And what was the basis for that? Because Portland is like, okay, federal buildings, but why Border Patrol?
Yeah, I can answer all of those questions. So first of all, Portland is in the 100-mile zone. It's something like 96 miles from the coast, right? So so it is right there. But actually, they were not there based on that authority. Instead, there's a section, I think it's section 1315 in the authorization of the Department of Homeland Security that gives the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security the authority to reassign federal agents to protect federal buildings, right? And so that's under the justification that they were there. And that provision is really broad. It says that in the protection of federal buildings, that they can enforce any law cognizant under any violation cognizant under the law, right? So right? So it's not like they have to be doing immigration or protecting the building, any violation of the law. And it says they can do investigations on and off the premises of that federal building, right? And so without any geographical limit to that, right? So you could, if you wanted to read that broadly, which I think probably the Trump administration will, you can read that to say they can do any law enforcement anywhere under that provision, right? Because it's any law and anywhere on or off the premises, right? So that law is on the books and still there, right? So that's also one, when this book came out in 2022, I tried to talk about this issue. The ACLU is well aware of this problem in the law, but it didn't get fixed. So it's still there. So that's what they were doing in 2020, right? So that you remember there were protests near the federal building in Portland. And so when you see like the pictures of masked agents like this, like hitting people in Portland, they were Border Patrol agents. You also may have seen videos of minivans pulling up and grabbing people off the street. That's what this picture is of. Not identifying themselves, not that clearly marked. Those were also Border Patrol agents that were doing that, right? And they were doing that all under that section of the Homeland Security Act. So do I have time to say one more thing?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe I can talk about that next book that you mentioned, because it plays a role in this. So the book that I'm working on right now is about the case Egbert versus Boulay, which was at the Supreme Court in 2022. So this came out right as my book came out. So it's not actually in the book, but it's a really important issue that emerged from that. So this was a situation where this guy, Bob Boulay, was assaulted by a Border Patrol agent in his driveway. And then the Border Patrol agent retaliated against him by reporting him to all these agencies and the IRS and things like that. There's no dispute about that happening. The question was whether he could sue the Border Patrol agent for damages, right, for violating his constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court eventually decided no in 2022, that there's no path to sue individual agents for violating your constitutional rights. And so then this case was used to throw out all of the cases of those people in Portland, right, who were trying to sue those agents for violating their rights. So all of them are tossed. So in the year after this decision, 100% of, they're called Bivens actions based on a case actually from that burger court in the 70s. They were tossed 100% against Border Patrol agents, and 88% of all attempts to sue federal agents were tossed based on Egbert versus Boulay after that case in 2022. So a real rollback of the ability to sue agents for violations of your rights. So that's what my next book is about that case and that guy. But the reason it's an HBO show is because it turns out that the guy is this just crazy character. So I don't know how well you can read the license plate on his car. Yes, his license plate is smuggler. This is his bed and breakfast here. The bed and breakfast is called the Smuggler's Inn. All of the rooms are named after famous smugglers. And this house is directly on the US-Canada border. So his backyard is Canada. If you've spent any time in like Washington State, there's actually a Canadian road right on the border. So that road is his backyard. And so you can probably guess that the punchline of it is he was quite involved in a lot of cross-border activity. So he was operating something like an underground railroad to Canada. So he helped about 1,500 people from Iraq and Afghanistan transit through the United States and then sneak into Canada to apply for asylum. And it was one of those people that he was protecting when the Border Patrol agent assaulted him in 2014. But he was also an informant for that Homeland Security investigations targeting the drug traffickers in this area. And so he was doing like secret operations with them as well, that's the part of the story that HBO is interested in. So, but he was arrested twice by Canada for the helping people to sneak into Canada. And then his case went all the way to the Supreme Court as well. So kind of a wild character.
There's one question from online. I would like to.
Okay, go ahead, Tiare.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for sharing with us. It's something that affects us all. In your experience, do you think it's just in the courts that we can influence change? So that's my first part. And then the second part, if there's other ways, what do you think they are?
No pressure.
So just save the world, huh? No, I mean, I think the courts are important, right? Because although the Supreme Court has been not great in the last few years, I think a lot of other courts have been pretty good at checking some of the things that the Trump administration is doing. So I do feel like that's one venue to continue to raise these issues. I think it's also just important to just show up at events to where people are contesting this, right? There are opportunities to accompany people who are going to ICE hearings and things like that, right? So that they have someone there with them and can document what happens, right, to them. I think all of that sort of thing is really important, right? Just to be present and to show that you don't think what's happening right now is right? And but then also finally, when we do have a different administration in the future, I still believe hopefully we will have that. Won't have Trump forever. We'll see. But it's time to fix these things, right? Like, I feel like that's the real failure of the last Biden period, right? It's like, he came into power and then didn't solve a lot of these things, right? That really needed to be fixed, right? So Insurrection Act, right? That definitely needs to be fixed. This Section 1315 of the Homeland Security Act needs to be fixed. Shrink the Border Patrol, that needs to be fixed, right? Like a ban racial profiling for immigration police, right? Like all of these things are very doable things. It just takes a little bit of will.
Let me just make a comment real quick. We had invited Professor Jones to join us from 12 to 1:30, so we're approaching that 1:30. I need to step out and into the next room for another event that starts at 1:30, so I'm gonna do that. And if you're willing to take a couple more questions, that's great. But I just wanted to I don't want us to like keep him over time. Just be respectful of that. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. If you didn't sign in on the way in, please sign in on the way out so I can get the money back for the pizza. And thank you so much, Professor Jones, for joining us. So I just want to thank you before I had to step out. But thank you again, and then I'll turn it back over to the questions.
Thanks.
Okay, the raid that happened yesterday in Kauai, they said there were two people from Tren de Aragua. And I'm wondering, to me, that sounds kind of fishy. And I'm wondering if you can comment on these supposed links to that group in some of these raids.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about that group, but there's, lots of evidence that the police and the Border Patrol, you shouldn't believe their first version of what they say, right? And it's also been very frustrating to me when the media does do that, right? They just transcribe exactly what the police tell them that inevitably turns out not to be true on further inspection. But often that first version shapes a lot of people's minds on what happens. So I don't know about that specific case very well, but that's my usual reaction to that.
Hi, Reece.
You probably do.
Thank you for that. My name is Gay, and I'm with a group called Hawaii J20 Plus, along with Yuko and Nandita. So we invite you to join us. We're an activist group, and we're actively dealing with issues around ICE. So there are 2 weekly protests against ICE, one on Wednesday and one on Thursday, both 5 to 6. The Wednesday one is in Waikiki in front of the Tesla dealership. The Thursday one is at the corner, the big intersection of Atkinson and Ala Moana. So it's been going on for months and very vibrant, lots of affirmation of honking and shaka and all that stuff. The other thing that we're doing is also to try and initiate a rapid response against ICE raids on Oahu. And we are trying to put that in place. So volunteers would be really great. We need a lot of people to put that in place. And that situation about Kauai, there was a tip about vehicles at the docks. But then governmental officials that some activists were connected to told them it was a legitimate sting operation. So they said that it was trusted sources, so it was called off, that it was fine, it was a legitimate, but it turned out that they swept up a whole lot of people. So there's some is on Kauai, and the person who the activist leading is a one chapter of the National Indivisible, Kauai Indivisible, and they're still saying is a legitimate operation, which I find very suspicious, the same way that you articulated before, because they're not saying that they're all gangsters. And why are these international powerful gangsters cleaning hotels? That makes no sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the changes that's happened recently is that before, like during the Biden administration, if there was an ERO raid to get 2 people that maybe is a legitimate raid, they would just take those 2 people, right? But now when they go somewhere, they're like checking everybody's documents and trying to use that one legitimate moment to snag anyone else that they can in that moment. So that certainly is a big change, I think, this year.
Okay, we're gonna go for one more question. Oh, you got one more?
So it's gonna be like criminalizing, it's class issues and criminalizing poor and mobility, and then also policing the poor, who has documents or not, and then, moving in the skies means already have passport and the money to fly over, and then those who don't have documents and the money need to walk around the checkpoints and then, exposing our life to death, right? So yeah, I was thinking about, those on Kauai cleaning the hotels, and then but all these narratives it turned into they are, quote unquote criminals and then like that. So I was thinking about your work and then others' work that always have class issues, you know, in it. But that's missing from all other things I'm hearing from the media and then so forth. That's what I thought. Yeah. Not questions, but yeah.
All right. This concludes our session with Reece. Thank you again, Reece. And thank you for those that have joined online. We wish you well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.